Hey there, my name's Evelyn,
My name's Samantha.
and you're listening to HCI Ideas. HCI Ideas is a podcast where we discuss research, receive advice, and learn more about the cool things taking place here at the Human Computer Interaction Institute of Carnegie Mellon University. Today, we'll be speaking with Professor Geoff Kaufman about his research on persuasive game designs and also his recent work on increasing accessibility in communication technology. Thanks for tuning in, and please enjoy this episode.
Hi, I'm Jeff. I have been a faculty member in the HCII since 2015, but I actually have deep roots in the HCII. I did my undergraduate in psychology at Carnegie Mellon, and my very first research job was in the HCII a number of years ago. This was before I went to grad school or came back as faculty. My first job was a research assistant in the learning science area. And then about 15 years later, my journey brought me back to CMU and to the HCII as faculty. In addition to being a faculty member, I also am the current PhD program director. So I've been doing that for the past few years, which has been a really rewarding experience as well. So broadening my involvement in the department, and it's specifically the focus on the PhD program and the students in that program.
Awesome. One of the biggest research focuses that you have is essentially game design, right? And something that you've worked on or contributed a lot to is the topic of embedded design or persuasive design. Can you walk us through the definition of what embedded design is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit complicated, so I'll try to keep this as simple as I can. But essentially, it comes down to my training is in social psychology, and which is really all about understanding how people interact and how people respond to some information and make decisions and form beliefs or perceptions about themselves, about other people, about society. And a lot of the work that I do in general applies psychology to designing experiences or interventions or tools and in the space of game design specifically, my colleagues and I have developed a framework that we call embedded design, which is all about how can you take persuasive content, persuasive messaging, psychological strategies or theories, and find ways of integrating that was meant to be transformational content into an experience in a way that doesn't overly draw attention to itself. Can you design a persuasive intervention that's subtle and effective? And so, over the past decade or so, my work has looked at uncovering and verifying and applying different strategies of this embedding method, where we take a key sort of persuasive message or persuasive content and find ways of putting it into an experience like a game in a natural, subtle way. That way, we're trying to basically counteract the typical response that humans have when people try to persuade them of reacting against it, of being defensive, of feeling threatened by that or manipulated. So we're trying to find ways of making what's meant to be persuasive information more approachable and more accessible. And especially when you're designing something like a game that's meant to be engaging and immersive and fun and enjoyable to some degree, these methods are really meant for those types of contexts where if you're being overly forceful or obvious about your attempt to persuade somebody on a topic like climate change, for example, or prejudice or bias, or other types of behaviors that are meant to be so prosocial in nature, there could be this natural defensiveness. So it's a way of basically being more subtle and strategic in the way you're designing something that's meant to be persuasive. And a lot of the work we've done has been in the space of game design.
Thank you for that explanation. I know that this is all, of course, designed to convey like a well-intended message and have positive effects, but is there any cases where this psychological aspect of game design be used almost against people and for like nefarious purposes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when you're talking about any method or approach to persuasion, the same types of strategies or methods can be used to persuade people in both positive or negative directions. That's the one of the keys of areas of ethical design is thinking about the implications of creating frameworks or guidelines or methods of persuasion. They could always be used for nefarious purposes, like you mentioned. So all the work that we do, of course, is in the space of promoting pro-social change, getting people to be more empathetic, less prejudiced, less biased, more socially conscious. But a lot of the same methods could, in theory at least, be used to promote behaviors that aren't in someone's best interest. And so, for that reason, a lot of our focus and the focus of those who work in the space of transformational design has also been to try to find ways of educating people about the potential negative use cases of these methods. Actually, design experiences are meant to protect people from unethical uses of these methods. When it comes down to it, the goal is to cause a change in a mindset, a change in a behavior. Of course, there's the potential for that nefarious, sabotaging or counterproductive use of these methods. The one bright spot, or something that gives me optimism there, is that typically the average person can only be induced so far outside of their comfort zone or boundary. We all have our own threshold of behaviors we would consider to be acceptable for ourselves. So, regardless of method of persuasion, it's really hard to get people to go outside of that area. If someone's already so susceptible or potentially open to a behavior that might be less positive or less prosocial, then of course persuasive methods could sort of steer them in that direction. But it's hard to get somebody to go against their core values and core beliefs in many instances. So there's a higher barrier to get people to succumb to those more nefarious applications of these principles.
I'm glad to hear the good news. But I guess my question in this case is games are, for the older generation, they're typically thought of as less positive. They take up your time, they may not necessarily have positive benefits. I'm not much of a gamer myself, but I know of how obsessed people can get with gaming, like spending thousands of hours on first person shooting games or whatever. And that has, I know, led to a lot of media attention in terms of school shootings. And when they dig into the history of these people, they find records of them playing games with a lot of violence in them and like shooting and guns and stuff like that. And then trying to draw this connection between the games and how that's translated into very harmful behavior in society. So I was just wondering, what is your take on these sorts of issues that has like a lot of implication for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes back to my previous response. There are thousands of studies on this topic of the relationship between the violence in media, including games, and violent behavior in real life context. So there's not necessarily definitive conclusions about that relationship, but a lot of the research would suggest that, much like I said earlier, those types of games aren't necessarily going to create a violent individual, but it might actually take someone who might have a predisposition or an inclination toward aggression or violence and sort of push them over that edge. And so it's this interaction between a person's own disposition, their own personality, their own motivations, and what the media experience might be doing for them. So for the average person, it might be the case that playing a violent video game might lead to a temporary sort of increase in aggression, but how that aggression is sort of exhibited will depend on that person's own sort of character, their own motivations, their own goals. In general, that's one conclusion that's fairly well accepted, that it might, on the average, increase someone's likelihood of exhibiting aggression, but the form it takes will depend on, and severity of it, extremity of it will depend on other factors that are sort of internal to a person that might be related to their personality, their current mental health, their current sort of life context. All these factors sort of add up to really complicated calculus. So you can't really make any firm conclusion about one, say, a violent video game, what effect it might have on a specific person without knowing so the holistic view of their internal and external experience. The good thing about the last few decades in game design has been there's a growing recognition of the potential for negative outcomes with violence and other types of content in media. There's been a growing movement toward creating games that have the opposite effect. Even cases where designers who sort of rail against first-person shooters as a genre are using that as subverting that genre, creating games where you're not shooting guns, but sort of shooting rays of kindness at enemies. So trying to take those same tropes and norms of games, knowing that they're popular, and they're popular for a reason. I think human nature is the part of human nature is to explore some of the darker side of our impulses. Like that's the born throughout our evolutionary history. Like there's a natural tendency to sort of confront and overcome some of these violent impulses that humans might have. But there's been a growing movement to sort of try to convert or provide a means of channeling some of that energy into a more positive outcome. that's been sort of the bright side in the last few decades. You're seeing fewer examples of violent games, or at least the ratio of violent to non-violent media. There's been a growing shift toward having more examples of the positive interactions or games that have a positive transformation on players.
So I guess there's a silver lining of, people taking games more seriously in that it can have a potentially very positive as well as negative impact. And so there's more of this directed effort into creating more prosocial games, as you said earlier. So that's good.
Yeah, and I put a lot of faith in the fact that there's a lot more academic game design happening in places like the HCII, where there's a nice, strong pocket of researchers and designers working in that space. And so we're sort of leading the way in many respects in terms of showing how that type of work can be done and producing sort of frameworks and models of game design that others can translate, whether they're in academia or in professional game design outside of academia. These principles and methods can work equally well if someone's trying to design a game with a positive outcome or positive purpose behind it.
Awesome. This is the perfect segue into my next question. So I know you've been involved in researching how to design games, but also at the same time kind of involved in designing games yourself. Can you describe what that process is like and how it was for you to take part in that process?
Yeah, it's been it's an interesting evolution in my career, at least. My training was pretty formal psychology, so doing traditional sort of laboratory experiments, building theories of human behavior. So my first entry point into game design was actually doing a postdoc in a very interesting design lab at Dartmouth College. So between finishing my PhD and starting at CMU as faculty, I did a few years of a postdoc in game design. That was my first sort of introduction to how I might start actually applying psychology to designing games. So I think that process is set in motion, this thinking of how to formalize this application of psychology to design in the form of a framework or methods that others could use. So essentially, my process at a high level often involves starting with defining what the actual transformational goal of the game or other experience might be. So that could be sort of shift in mindset or about a specific topic, like climate change, like I mentioned earlier, or an increase in empathy or reduction in prejudice toward a specific group. So that's always the first point for me is understanding what is the actual outcome, who's the audience we're trying to reach, and what types of outcomes we want to achieve through the game experience. And by identifying those as a first step, we can then start to think about, well, what types of games or game experiences might be especially well suited to that type of outcome. And that might dictate things like, oh, are we going to design a digital game or a non-digital game? Is it important to have sort of face-to-face interaction between people talking about a topic? So some of the early games I worked on were not actually fully non-digital. The first game design projects that I took part in were completely non-digital card games about bias and prejudice. So we thought it was really important to have face-to-face interactions in those games rather than say mediated interactions, because having so that immediate feedback of seeing people's responses, we designed games were meant to be played in social contexts, informal social contexts like parties or in coffee shops. And so it's really important to understand the connection between the context of play and the medium of the game and the outcomes we were going for. And we really thought having that social dynamic and where you're observing other people's responses and reacting to them, and even having side conversations about the material in the games was really important. In contrast, other times it works much better to have a digital format where maybe you're designing something that's meant to be an individual experience. You want to take advantage of the affordances of a digital platform. So some of the more recent work I've done has been designing individual narrative, interactive narrative games where you're sort of exploring a character, you're embodying a totally different persona. You're exploring this narrative world that's built for you, making decisions about how the character is responding. So in that case, it's really important to have a digitized experience where you can use the features of an interactive media in ways that can provide that transformation, provide a space for reflection. So it all depends on the outcomes you're going for, the type of experience you want to create, and matching the design decisions that you're making to those outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
a quick question on the side for any audience who might want to experience these games that have the persuasive design elements in them. Do you have any quick like recommendations off the top of your head that you think are kind of good games for people to try out?
Games that I've worked on, or just games in general?
In general, I mentioned earlier that I don't play games that often, but I think if anyone wants to try them out, it'd be good to have a few suggestions on hand from an expert.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in general, there's a great repository of persuasive games that academic researchers and designers have compiled. So if you just do a quick internet search for games for change, you'll find a lot of really great examples of persuasive games. But if I have to identify a few examples that I think I would recommend to show the power and potential of games, and I'll focus on ones I think represent sort of embedded design to go back to the earlier discussion. I think that's, again, where my own perspective comes from. But I think two games that I often recommend as good examples of embedded design. One is a super popular game. It started out as sort of a media campaign, but has now evolved into a series of games called Dumb Ways to Die. So if you've played that game or seen it, it has various incarnations now, including a non-digital card game version. But essentially, if you haven't played it, essentially it's a game where you as the player are interacting with these sort of amorphous creatures in these series of mini games, and these characters are about to face sort of a grisly death in some form. They could be sort of surrounded by piranhas or killer bees, or about to stick a fork into a plugged-in toaster, etc. All these sort of morbid, sort of potential ways that these characters might die, and you as the player are trying to sort of prevent that from happening. But as you're playing it, occasionally you're going to come upon a scene where the character is at a train station where they might be about to step over the safety line or maybe falling onto the tracks, and you're trying to prevent them from doing that. And in fact, that's what the game was designed initially for, to reduce train related or train station related accidents or injuries. It was actually commissioned by the Transportation Authority in Australia as an intervention to try to reduce train related or train station related accidents or deaths. And it was usually successful. It remains really popular, but it leverages a lot of embedded design methods. For one, there's a technique called intermixing, where not every single mini game is about trains. And train stations. Otherwise, many people wouldn't even be interested in the first place. So the designers knew that if they just peppered in those examples occasionally, that'll be a way of capturing people's attention and keeping their attention. So when they do come upon those examples of train-related accidents, they're going to maybe remember them more and engage with them more. It also uses humor as sort of a distancing feature. So it provides sort of a safe space where you're exploring pretty, when it comes down to very pretty dark subject matter of death and accidents. But it uses humor and the distancing of these creatures, these fictional creatures, as a way to get people to engage with this dark subject matter. So that's one great example, I think, of a persuasive game that's super popular, but uses these embedded methods really effectively. I'll mention one other
That's great.
example of a game. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, 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 you can keep going. I just like the song is playing in my head
Yeah.
right now.
It's yeah, that's an example of using persuasive methods and marketing expertly, and the fact that it had a pro-social sort of goal behind it. And it shows that oftentimes it might be counterintuitive to try to use something like humor or fictionalization to engage people with pretty serious topics. But my work and others' work have shown over and over that those are actually ways to get more people into the experience in the first place, and it can often be really much more effective than a comparable approach that takes a much more literal or straightforward method of engaging people with that topic. Because the topic itself, especially if it's a threatening or alienating in some way, you might not even want to engage with something that's about that topic to begin with. So, comparing the number of people who would watch a documentary, for example, about train accidents or train related accidents versus playing a really fun game, there's really no comparison. People are be much more inclined to engage with a game that's designed sensitively but effectively to provide some insight about those experiences. So Dumb Ways to Die, absolutely 100% recommend, is a great example of persuasive design. The second example is lesser known, but one I really echoes with my own perspective on game design, is a game called Gone Home. It's a digital interactive sort of exploration game. I'm not going to spoil it. So essentially, there's a persuasive or transformational goal the game has, but it does a nice job of hiding it. At its surface, the game is about a college student who returns home to visit her family, but comes to realize when she gets there that her parents and sister are missing. So as you as the player embody this role of this college student, and you end up exploring the house, your childhood home, for clues about what's happened. And at its surface, it seems like it's a fairly sort of traditional sort of horror themed game. It's very sort of suspenseful and ominous. But as you play it, you start to understand that what appeared to be sort of sinister clues or evidence, maybe something really terrible happened to your family, what you're expecting actually is subverted by the reality of what the game shows you, which you have to play the game to actually get to that point where the revelation happens. I won't spoil it, but for me, that's another great example in meta design. So it gives you sort of one expectation, but subverts it completely. You go in expecting this to be a horror game, and it is in some sense. But the actual message of the game is really nicely revealed later in the experience. So this delayed reveal is another embedded design method, actually, where you can get people to engage with something, maybe playing on their expectations of what's going to happen, and then that subversion of the expectation later in the experience can be very eye-opening and persuasive as a result. So Gone Home would be a second recommendation of a great persuasive game. And what I think is why I'm recommending these two specifically is they don't look on the surface like they are persuasive interventions. And that's really the hallmark of embedded design. The more you're broadcasting that you're designing something that has sort of an intention behind it or a message behind it or a specific change you want to bring about, the less effective in general that approach tends to be. These are great sort of immersive experiences that can have a really profound effect on people, even without them even realizing it's going to happen until they've gone through that experience.
That's great. I'll definitely try it out, later when I have time. Okay, so let's pivot into our next topic. Something else that Jeff focuses on in terms of research. I kind of lump it all into kind of this group of communication technologies. This might be a bit of a packed question, so feel free to take some time to organize your thoughts. From a social psychologist's perspective, what do you think is the best way to increase or uphold fairness in technology today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like the way we approach those types of projects that look at fairness or equity is one way of answering that. I think the fact that we start from the perspective of members of specific either marginalized or underrepresented groups is pivotal, because oftentimes when technologies are designed in industry, they're not designed with specific underrepresented populations at the forefront. They don't center the perspectives or needs of those groups. If anything, they're almost an afterthought in some cases. That's changing slowly, but there's still a lot of examples where we see technologies that have clear shortcomings or clear biases, or a lack of functionality at the very least when it comes to specific numbers of populations, whether it's people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, etc. Across the board, members of groups that are more in the minority, or those who don't often have a seat at the table in designing those technologies or being the heads of companies creating those technologies, you often have those perspectives either under considered or ignored outright. And if anything, even inclusive design methodologies that exist often don't center those perspectives as much as they should. So our work is trying to basically start from the perspective of a member of a group who's affected by a technology like a voice assistant, or a language learning technology, and understand what their experiences are, their needs are, and try to make sure that technology is serving them primarily and first and foremost. So putting their needs and psychological well-being at the forefront rather than making an afterthought or something you correct for after you realize the problems that your technology might have. So we're trying to sort of find those issues and try to encourage designers and engineers who create these technologies to do better in terms of addressing what might be really profound negative impacts of these technologies. And so we never presume that we know the right answer. We never presume any solution. We always try to engage and invite members of those groups to work with us on the research and design aspects, so we ensure that their perspective is honored and respected, and then try to share those insights with members of industry who are creating these technologies in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that at least in recent years, whenever there's mishaps with AI or machine learning technologies, oftentimes the blame is shifted on to more of like the technological aspect of these systems. Like, oh, we don't have, representative data sets, and that's why the training process went awry because we just don't have enough data or whatever, which is a valid problem, obviously, in itself. But I just don't think there's like enough attention being shed on the human aspect of in like development process of these technologies and who's involved and who they're serving and
Yeah, 100%. And we're finding that, like, one of the especially insidious parts about that is that we're finding, at least with our research and voice assistants, that sometimes members of underrepresented communities start to internalize blame. So if the technology isn't functioning for them, that the voice assistant doesn't understand what they're saying or misinterprets something they've asked for in a voice prompt, or in a speech to text interface, many times they'd be tempted to blame themselves, blame the way they speak, blame their dialect or accent or their proficiency in English as the problem, and not putting the blame where it really belongs on the limitations of the technology, whether it's, as you mentioned, the data that's driving it, the fact that it doesn't honor or respect diversity as much as it should, doesn't respond to diverse inputs as much as it should. This is across many dimensions. We focus on race specifically right now in that work, but we can talk about dimensions of disability, for example. Even something like a regional dialect could be a basis for a technology not functioning properly. And there's lots of research showing that's the case. So our work is trying to sort of address that by developing interventions to help people realize, oh no, the fault isn't with me, it's with the technology. It's not being designed for me at the forefront. So I as much as possible, I should try to avoid internalizing that blame and redirecting it back to the assistant. In fact, some of the work we're doing now is trying to find ways that the technology can respond to users in ways that make them more aware of that, of redirecting the blame back to the technology's own limitations, and try to affirm a user to feel empowered and not diminished by an experience like that.
awesome. I did briefly mention this earlier how there was this paper of yours that caught my eye about language learning technology, specifically for immigrants who are trying to learn English. Basically, this paper is highlighting the challenges that often people encounter with these technologies. I think there's a lot of very good suggestions and alternatives to overcoming these challenges. But what are your thoughts on, like, how they transfer into our real daily lives in terms of actual solutions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something we grapple with in that project. I'll give a shout out to my PhD student Adinala, who's leading that research. But we have chosen to look at designing virtual reality environments for language learning with the constant sort of understanding and reservation that virtual reality still remains not fully accessible to the general population. The technology is still far from affordable. It's getting better, but still the average person may not be able to have access to virtual reality in their day-to-day life. So if we're designing these experiences that rely on virtual reality, we have to understand how can we design in a way that makes our intervention or makes our experience accessible. So to that end, we're trying to find some contexts that already have access to technology and working with community partners that will have us set up, as well as having our own internal sort of setup that we can invite members of the community in to experience those interventions or those VR environments in ways that don't present an undue cost to them. And so for us, the value and the effectiveness of virtual reality for social experience has been our main motivation. But we have to be aware of the fact that if we're designing interventions that the vast majority of our intended population can't access, that they're useless. In fact, they might do more harm than good, knowing that there's a promising intervention that only a fraction of the population can have access to. So we're being very mindful about trying to find a way to even if someone doesn't have their own access to technology, we can provide that access for them or work with partners who have that infrastructure in place already. So that's a great question, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about starting from the perspective of the needs and experiences of the audience we're designing for. So we did a lot of early work, sort of assessing sort of interests and needs in terms of language learning from immigrant populations, and a lot of them expressed interest in some technological tools that can augment their language learning experience. And that was really the foundation for deciding to pursue virtual reality and now a bit of augmented reality as well, in ways that would be accessible, that don't require like, expensive setups or expensive technology.
So we've hit past the 30-minute mark, but I really need to ask a few questions with TikTok. I know you only did like a few papers on the relevant field, but You must have had to download TikTok and like go on it yourself and try it out, right?
Yeah, I was a pretty avid user before that research. Yeah, as a brief background, this was a study that some colleagues and I did right around so 2020, 2021, so with the context of COVID-19, where we want to understand how people were using social media like TikTok in that pretty traumatic context for doing things like sharing information or getting resources or just having an outlet for socializing or communicating in the era of COVID. So that was the nature of that work. So that was part of the focus, understanding sort of how people turn to social media for sort of relief or respite, even for information. So the variety of uses of a platform like TikTok for engaging in a time where face-to-face interaction was all but prevented. So that was sort of the background for that work. But more generally, I'm interested in how people respond to sort of algorithmic decision making about their own daily experience. So social media platforms like TikTok rely on algorithms to feed content to people. And oftentimes that can work well, where it might align with your interests and it might align with your consumption habits. But other times that can go really wrong. That especially might be the case for members of marginalized groups, where the algorithm makes presumptions about somebody's identity and feeds them content that's actually offensive or not in line with their interests or their perspective. So that was another angle we looked at with TikTok in terms of how do people form perceptions of why the algorithm is making certain decisions. How do people should try to interact with or subvert algorithms to make sure that the platform is serving their own needs or their own sort of priorities better? And so I think that's really interesting as well. I'm really super keen on any type of work that looks at empowering people to sort of take control of their own media experiences and not being beholden to what an algorithm is assessing, how it's assessing them or how it's concluding things about them. So I love any kind of work that's subversive in nature, especially these everyday behaviors where users are taking control through a deeper understanding what the algorithm is doing and how it's working.
I think it's just so strange and I guess in a way fascinating as well how no one knows how the TikTok algorithm works, both as like a content consumer and also content creator. For your research, I know you had to download TikTok. So how many hours did you spend? I'm just curious. Did you get kind of sucked in as well, like us young people, 7 hours of screen time in a day? Like
Yeah, normally I'm pretty good about avoiding that. Like I'm not prone to doom scrolling. I'm pretty mindful of. In fact, a lot of the I teach a class on persuasive design where many times students they'll focus their class projects on ways of reducing overconsumption of social media or more mindful consumption. So I follow that guideline as well. I try to be pretty mindful about my social media use, but I will say like many others during COVID-19, I did absolutely fall into. I mean, there's a reason why TikTok is so usually popular. You can, especially if you can sort of tailor the algorithm to give you the content that you find the most entertaining or the most engaging. In fact, I would say as a result of that process, I started discovering maybe my own stereotypes about TikTok. I realized, oh, there's actually a lot more substantive content than you might expect. So finding a lot of educational content, for example, which actually has led to some other research that we're doing in how TikTok can be used, for example, to educate people about societal topics like Black history, for instance. If people don't know much about it, if they don't identify with that specific racial group, they can use TikTok for not just entertainment but also for education. So I feel like the time I spend, which admittedly was a lot of hours, as you hinted, during that time we were studying it, is partly for informing the research, but definitely partly for own self interest. That my own sort of my own entertainment, my own consumption habits were met by that behavior as well. But it led to a lot of insights about the platform that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I think there's definitely an upside to it.
I would consider the persuasive design of TikTok absolutely as a nefarious design because of the insane amount of hours I think me and all my friends we spent on these apps. Yeah, that's a little much. But
Yeah, I mean, I think any type of media that is meant to be sort of engaging, like there's research on the psychology of flow, where you feel so absorbed in an activity, including a game or social media, that you sort of lose track of your reality. On the one hand, that could be a really positive experience for people, like actually putting all your attention to something and feeling sort of all your emotions and thoughts engaged with it could be really beneficial. But the flip side, as you're hinting at, and just here, is that that can become addicting pretty easily. So there's a fine line between sort of immersion and engagement, which can be a really positive thing, and addiction, where you start to sort of engage in these behaviors in ways that sort of are counterproductive or maybe even a threat to your physical or mental well-being. So as consumers and designers of these experiences, is always something to be aware of. Immersion is great, but addiction is something you want to always be on guard against.
Yeah, I was definitely addicted in COVID. So that brings an end to our segment about your research. Just a question or two to kind of close off this interview that steps back a little bit. We've had 30 years so far with HCII. There's a lot of good things that came out of those 30 years. But where do you see HCII, both as a field and also maybe you can maybe comment on like our CMU HCI department as well. Where do you think we're headed for the next 30 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna be guided by sort of the past 5 to 10 years of the department as sort of a signpost for where we're heading, and for me, it's a really encouraging pattern that we have expanded our faculty considerably to include researchers who focus on fairness and accessibility and equity in technology. So I feel like that really is going to be sort of like a guiding force for the future of the field. I think we're recognizing the limitations that technology has had over the past half century or more, and starting to address those limitations in terms of how technology is harming specific populations, how it's exacerbating societal biases and prejudices, and just being more socially conscious in the way we're thinking about technology. Whether it's a new form of technology like generative AI and understanding both its strengths and limitations, and just being more honest and open about our need to do better when it comes to serving society and having a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, and a moral responsibility when it comes to the way we approach the design and research of technology. So that could include having a lens of equity and fairness. It could be engaging more with community partners and organizations, not creating technology sort of in a vacuum, understanding the broader context of their implementation, being candid about the shortcomings that emerge in those technologies. So for me, that really is the future of ACI, a much more socially conscious, socially aware perspective that we all have when it comes to creating these technologies responsibly and ethically. So again, it might sound a bit idealistic, but I really do feel that based on our own departmental patterns and the patterns in the field as a whole, it's going to become much more of a strong sort of essential guiding force for HCI research and design going forward.
That's it for today. Thank you, Jeff, and everyone for tuning in. If you're interested in finding out more about Jeff's research and what he does, we'll be linking some of the relevant papers and also his website in the description below. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
HCI Ideas is a podcast celebrating the 30th anniversary of Carnegie Mellon's Human Computer Interaction Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us and recommend it to your friends. To learn more about the interesting research done here at HCII, our friends have created a website showcasing the various papers and topics we talked about today, as well as many more. You can find it at hcii30.com. You should check it out, it's pretty cool. Thank you for listening to HCI Ideas, and we'll catch you next time.